Okay, with that, it is 12:01. We will get this meeting started of the Dane County Cities and Villages Association Roundtable for February. And I had mentioned this earlier, but for those of you that are joining us, if you can identify your name, obviously, in which municipality you're representing, that would be helpful for us. So today we have Philip Cosson and Brian Raymer from Ehlers Financial Advisors, and they're here to talk about municipal referendums that cities and villages may have already done or may be contemplating. And you can ask questions along the way if you can just get our attention, and Phil and Brian will try to answer those questions. So with that, Phil, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for being here today.
Yep, great. Thank you. I get the privilege of working with Bob as his role as president of the Village of Windsor. So it's always nice to see you. Thank you for the invite, Ann. We certainly appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion with you. Phil Cosson with Ehlers and Brian Raymer, we're going to tag team this a little bit. And we don't have a lot of material. We hope it generates discussion and some questions. And if we don't feel comfortable that we have the exact answer for you, we could certainly circle back and get that over to Ann and Bob, and they can distribute that information to you. For those who don't know who Ehlers is, and I think most people probably on the call have some idea, we're municipal advisors. Really operating in the upper Midwest. Both Brian and I are in our Pewaukee, Wisconsin office. We represent about 300 local units of government in the state of Wisconsin on a variety of issues. And we do a lot of work in regards to levy limits, which then brings us into this discussion of referendums on a regular basis. But we're also heavily involved in economic development, debt issuance, rate studies, investments, and a wide gamut of work on behalf of our municipal clients. In our role working with a lot of municipalities, as I mentioned, it takes us into a discussion under, what flexibility or what options do you have under levy limits, and municipal referendums is one. But in many cases, what leads to a broader discussion about what options you have available to you is we take a lot of our clients through either a long-range financial management plan or capital plan, which a lot of times leads to this, how are we going to pay for all of this or this increased service? So we will be touching on a lot of those issues as we go through this presentation today. We have kind of a short table that we're going to go through. We have levy limits constraints. I think everybody's pretty aware of what those constraints are, but we'll talk about those in a little detail. Referendum prep and a case study. We actually have two case studies. Brian's going to talk about some work we did in Cambridge, Wisconsin, and I'll touch a little bit on a referendum that was held by the Village of Butler for police services that we have a little more detailed information on. And as I indicated, we expect we'll have time for questions along the way. Here are the cold realities as operating a municipal government these days. Why we are here is that net new construction has really been outpaced by expenses. And under levy limits, while it's the law has changed a little bit since 2005, you're allowed to increase your expense budget by net new construction. And while we've seen a significant amount of growth throughout the state of Wisconsin, I think 13% annual growth last year of all property, a lot of that is just economic growth, where we see appreciation of property, which doesn't necessarily benefit you when it comes to budget. You're really tied back to primarily net new construction, which tends to be somewhere between 1 and maybe 3 to 4% annually. And in some down years, could be less than 1%. So the reality is Like most all other communities, and what we see is that we have this continued increase in expenses that are not fully able to be paid for by net new construction. And one of the areas that we've seen most of the referendum work done is around protective service costs, police, fire. Many communities now are looking at that were maybe paid on call or volunteer fire have now looked to bring on more full-time firefighters. And that has really created budget shortfalls or challenges within levy limits to take on that type of work. So as you're well aware, over the last almost 20 years under levy limits, you've tightened the belt strings already. Municipal staffing has been streamlined, budgets cut for almost 20 years. And so when we talk about options that are out there, they're limited. And I think most of you know that. There are communities out there that have some flexibility still, and many of those have flexibility because they haven't used some of the adjustments, for instance, like the debt adjustment to the full capacity. And so they've had some flexibility, but most communities have really maximized the different revenue opportunities and your ability to grow budgets over the last 20 years under levy limits. So while we acknowledge that the increased shared revenue will provide some relief, we still think that long-term budgets are probably not financially sustainable, especially in high growth communities where they are providing more protective service costs over the next number of years. So those are kind of the reality is of what we're seeing. So our slide here, you've done everything you can up to this point. Now what? And in many cases, the now what that we start talking about with our municipal clients are referendum. And while that is not an easy task to go through, we're going to give you a couple examples of how it was done elsewhere and where it was done successfully elsewhere. It also, we think there's some planning involved needed as well. And the last thing you want to do is prepare a referendum that maybe in the same year as maybe a school referendum that's being brought forward. So you need to really plan and think what around when you're going to present a referendum, so that you're not necessarily tied to the same time frame as maybe a school referendum that's being brought forward. So here's a chart over the last 8 or so years that show what levy limits referendums have passed, either one time or ongoing referendums, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. But you can see they have grown over the last, especially the last 3 to 4 years. We have a few communities that have gone to referendum and been unsuccessful as well. So this is the referendums that have passed just by the number over the last number of years. And this is information that comes directly from the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. So you can see referendums, while it's still sparsely used, is becoming more frequent as we get along here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to talk a little bit about the process that Cambridge went through with their successful referendum.
Sure. Thank you, Phil. Ultimately, when you're preparing for a referendum, we like this little graphic here that it is all hands on deck. I think the biggest message that's kind of in the last bullet point in terms of create a timeline, but maybe not most iterated, is this should be done well in advance. That can help with your public relations in terms of getting support from the public. This should be exercised to understand maybe what the options are for various levy limit amounts that you would like to change your base levy to as a result of public safety or other operating expenditure needs. So this is a slide to kind of start that planning process, but understand We're kind of the mindset that you want to look at this at least a year in advance. Now, that doesn't always happen. I'll say in our experience, and particularly mine, it's a little bit more rushed than that. Typically 3 months, 1 month, maybe under a month. But understand that the longer time that you give yourself, the better opportunity you have to explain it. And the more people understand something, the more willing they will be to support it. But some of the items to do to kind of prepare is we would recommend visiting the Wisconsin Election Commission website that talks through the required notices that you will eventually have to send out so that you can kind of prepare your timeline in getting those notices properly distributed to the public. You want to make sure you discuss your needs and due dates with the county clerk. We've found this very advantageous to kind of help with their internal processes that they're handling at the county level, to understand when they would prefer information instead of having to react and be surprised from some of the information that you're providing. And then kind of developing that public relations and communications plan with the governing body can be an augmented strategy in order to build that support. You know, it's can be easy to crunch the numbers, and we'll kind of do that. But at the same token, it's helpful to kind of build certainly a PR strategy. You know, whether that's flyers, public information meetings, etc. So looking at that process, looking for an increase via an approved referendum. That referendum may take place in a spring or primary election, or looking at the partisan primary or general election. So you can also do some school board election dates on odd years only. This information is laid out kind of in full on the Wisconsin Election Commission's website. But in summary here, you need to pass a resolution as well, indicating your desire to increase this levy limit. And that resolution does need to state a couple of things, the amount and whether or not it is on one time, limited time, or ongoing. So you can do a referendum for a one-time increase in the levy limit. Those are likely due to a capital expense or some sort of infrequent expense that you're asking to levy over and above your levy limitation in order to take care of this one-time expense. A limited time referendum may be something that you're asking for 10 years of additional cash flow through adjusting the levy. That might be building towards a capital expense, or something that you see an expense that'll occur but then go away in the future. So you may do a 5-year base increase to your levy, a 10-year base increase, or whatever's needed. Or if you just want a base building increase, it's called an ongoing referendum, meaning that you will change your base in the next year, assuming that this referendum passes. So that resolution includes that detail, as well as it should include the question, in which this slide kind of identifies here. Looking at the ballot language, you want to pose the question exactly as set forth by statute and identify the purpose for the increase. So when Phil was kind of talking about, you know, budgetary pressures as a result of public safety, that would need to be explicitly stated for the reason that you are increasing or requesting the increase, to the base levy. And then the other item is to there's kind of a calculation that does have to go on the ballot, stating where your levy limitation and percentage increase would be and what you're requesting it should be. So we have gotten guidance from the DOR to say that you need to use last year's actual net new construction and not a projection of the net new construction moving forward, unless the timing were to work out that percentage amount were to be released as it is in August. And if you were able to get that information and get that on the ballot in time, you could use, that amount that was provided from the state. Otherwise, typically you're using last year's actual percentage as noted on the slide here. So here's kind of a case study. We did provide kind of the full detail just for reference material if you're gonna take this home and munch on it later. So it is understandably kind of a wide chart here, but the exercise for the case study that was done in Cambridge, Wisconsin, was they were feeling budgetary pressures from their joint fire department, and they were not qualifying for the joint fire allowable levy increase. If you don't know what that is, there is a line item on your levy limit worksheet that does allow you, should the total charges to member communities of the joint fire department not increase more than consumer price index plus 2%, and everybody adopts a resolution, even if the member communities are not using this adjustment, but for one of them, all communities do need to pass that resolution to say that they would allow this one community to use that adjustment. You can increase your levy through that allowable adjustment. Now, this joint fire department was increasing their charges to the total member communities greater than CPI plus 2%. And the exercise shown on screen here, just kind of leading your eyes towards the bottom, their actual levy started to slowly become not enough. When they looked at what is the change in our allowable levy, as kind of shown on the third to the most bottom line there, what is the increase from the fire EMS district actual or budget, and then do we have any residual allowable levy, before our own budgetary needs? And so that answer was starting, in 2028 levy year for budget year 2018 for 2019, excuse me. That amount started to be getting negative. So before making their own budgetary adjustments, they didn't have enough levy to just take care of the joint fire and EMS charges. So this was a multi-year exercise that they were starting to see the problem growing, and they said net new construction clearly is not enough. We're going to look at some budgetary changes, and the only way we can kind of do this is through net new construction. Through the referendum, and we do not have the flexibility but for making cuts in our own budget to control this. So what the final two columns kind of show there would be without the referendum, and with the referendum, what their levy needs would be. And the one thing that we'll point out is that 4.306 number again is they had to use the assumption that it's the same net new construction from the prior year to get to this ballot number to say, we want to increase our allowable levy, what would have been 1.425 million to 1.520 million. So they were adding a $95,000 base levy increase to be approved by referendum. So net new construction, kind of to summarize there, net new construction was being outpaced by the fire district budget alone. That was even before their own internal budgetary needs. The village was continually forced to make budget cuts each year to meet those fire district needs because they literally had no other options. They looked at analysis on an effect on tax rates at various referendum amounts. We went from like 150,000 base increase to 50,000, and they kind of landed in the middle at 95,000 based off of the tax increases. They didn't want to go too low because if they were to need it again in 2 years, you can obviously understand how that might not sell as well. And then the fact of going too high, that might not pass on the original ballot either. So they chose the 95,000 for those reasons, and the referendum passed by 1 vote, which is enough.
Every
Well-
vote counts, right?
Yes, yes, and a
It
clear
sure
example of that.
Sure did in that case. We'll give you another case study without going through all the financials that Brian just did to get to a number. This was the Village of Butler back in 2022, where they hired a firm to assist them with these two different documents that I'm going to share with you. That was a mailing that went out to all of the residents, and it was information based. But the goal here was to get a base of information out to the public to eliminate all that scuttlebutt that occurs out in the public, and try to get everybody on the same plane as far as what the needs were in the Village of Butler. So this is the front of the mailer that went out to all the different property owners in the Village of Butler. And as you can see here, they actually this is the first question that they wanted to get out there. And what they were really trying to build is the case on the right-hand side of the amount of service calls that are occurring, and that have occurred in the village since 2014, a 93% increase. But in addition to that, they kind of laid out where a lot of those increases were, and they did it by a percent basis, comparing 14, 15, 16 into 17, and then 2018 through 2021, just to drive home the information for the public of the need for, or the critical need for additional police officers in the community. And as you can see here, the growth was across the board, from criminal damage, entry to vehicles, weapon offenses, drug offenses, overdoses, retail theft. It was across the board growth that they had seen over time. So on the left side of this document, that they wanted to at least identify what it would cost for them to add these different police officers. So they equated it to essentially one full-time officer and all their equipment needs. And they identified, the property tax impact for the assessed property value at 100,000, 125,000. A couple years later, that number would grow a great deal, and then equate it to the tax increase that they would start to see in their 2022 bills, depending on the value of the home. Again, $100,000, $56 per year. If it's 200,000, it's double that. 300,000 is triple that. $125,000. So in this case, Butler really was making a case for the need for additional protective service to be provided. They didn't have levy capacity to be able to grow their budget without going to referendum. So this is the first item that they had sent out as information based. And then the second was identified here, where again, they've kind of built the case as to what the costs were going to be, and then they updated some of the information. So they were looking here at what would 2 or more officers on duty more than 65% of the time. So they started to break it down to get a little more granular in the information that they were providing. There was feedback. Kayla Thorpe, who was in our office now, was the administrator at the time in Butler, indicated they got a little pushback on the property, assessed property value number. They bumped that up, and then they started to break it down again by year, by home value, and then on a per month basis, so that people would get a feel for what the actual cost was. They held public information meeting in regards to this, 2 separate public information meetings before this went out to referendum, to try to build the case for the need for this referendum to go through. So it's a lot of what Brian had talked about earlier, is that kind of all hands on deck planning. They hired a firm to help put together the documentation. They ran their own numbers, and then they held public hearings to make sure that people were aware of what the needs were well in advance of the actual referendum coming out. And I don't have a slide in here that says it, but it was successful. And I think Kayla Thorpe, again, was the administrator, then told me it passed at almost 90%. the referendum. So it was a very significant win. They think for the village, and the public really bought into it. In part because of all the planning work that had been done well in advance. And that as you know, information, if you can get the information out there sooner than later, that sometimes just kind of squashes down some of that kind of chatter that happens in the coffee shops and wherever else, as to what the true impacts were, and they got this information out very early. So very successful in their case, to be able to put that in place. So those are a couple of examples of some information. We have a couple of other case studies that we could also provide if people want to see those, but wanting to at least keep our discussion point to about a half an hour and then open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you both. Brian, there was a question in the chat. What was the tax impact for the average property in Cambridge as of the result of that referendum?
I would have to go back and look exactly, but I can do that if we want to tackle some other questions, and then I can get back to that exact number.
Okay. And then Lisa from Middleton is asking, is there any evidence to show whether hiring an outside firm to help with public information has an impact on the success rate?
I don't know if there is data that's been kind of centered around that question. I could tell you that in the case of Butler, that were there at kind of their wits' end, they were really up against it, and they needed to make sure that this passed. They took the approach that we're going to really hire a firm that can get the word out in a more effective way than we probably can alone. I can tell you that there's another firm that's out there that does a great deal of this type of work. I'm not going to plug them, but they do. They're a communications firm, and they're used by quite a few communities throughout the state to help put this type of product out there for the public to consume in advance of the actual referendum occurring. But I don't think there's we don't have anything that shows that it's more successful one way or the other. Okay.
And then are there state laws or guidelines that prohibit a municipality from actually promoting the referendum versus just giving the actual information about the referendum?
Yeah, you got to be very careful that the information that's being provided isn't being provided as a way to sell it. It's information based, and if you look at what was done in the case of Butler here, that it looked promotional, right? It just kind of the view of it, but it's really just information based. They really wanted to stick to telling the message on the right-hand side of the page about why the need, and then they wanted to get to the this is the impact. And so it wasn't to promote the referendum. They wanted to promote people coming out to vote for it, but it wasn't to promote the success of it. It was really just information based, and you are not allowed to promote the passage of a referendum, but you're required to provide very specific guidance. Now, that's partly why, as Brian alluded to, the questions really have to be formed in a certain way, and that's guided by the state as to how the questions look. Okay.
And then Regina from Madison is asking, are there any tested messages that seem to resonate better than others from your experience?
I think I would say our experience has been public safety tends to do well. It's kind of the theory of school districts. It's for the kids, right? But for municipalities, it's really, I think, a challenge to sell the public on we need more staff for public works, community development, whatever. I think it's an easier sell when you start talking about protective services, and you can make the case like Butler did of why, and the why is response. It could be response times. It could be a lot of different issues, but we tend to see public safety. The other thing is why we wanted to include the Butler slides is because they really did a very effective job in making the case, and I think that's really what you need to do more than anything else. You need to clearly define, why there's the need for additional staffing, in this case, in the way of police officers, and kind of lay that out for them.
Okay. And then a few more questions here. Matt from Cottage Grove is asking, what is the largest tax impact that you've seen approved by these referendums? And maybe you don't have that off the top of your head.
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt. I don't right offhand. I don't know, Brian, if you have any knowledge of a larger scale one, but the Butler one was not insignificant, only in that, it's a very small community. So it wasn't insignificant, but I don't right offhand, Bob, have a number.
So I guess a follow-up question that I have on that, you showed us the chart about the number of referendums over the past, number of years. Do you have any idea how many of those were just one time only, and then like a 5-year time frame, or the amount that were ongoing?
I can actually share my screen because I have a similar chart when we actually broke that out, and a PR firm that we co-presented with at WGFOA had a little bit more data to play with. So I will share my screen to kind of show that here.
I'm gonna stop. Are you able to right now, Brian?
I am.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
Good.
So this is with one less year. We didn't have 2022 at the time that we did this presentation, but the ongoing kind of being in gray are definitely more frequent in the later years, and kind of increasing. I think you'll see that in 2018, but then definitely 2020 and 2021, the limited time or ongoing with the termination as well. And then those one-time referendums being quite limited there, being in the blue here, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely ongoing are more frequent. The DOR page as well does provide, if you were to like hover over this information at the DOR's website, you can see which municipality, whether it was ongoing, and I believe the dollar amount, if I remember that correctly. So if you do visit this website, it should give you the answers to maybe largest dollar amount, but that wouldn't give you tax rate impact. That would be a function of where were they, and then where were they going with the passage of this referendum, which would vary by municipality. To go back to the original question about the change in the tax rate for Cambridge, they were based off their planned budget for operations. It was $5.20 per thousand, and with the 95,000 referendum, it was going to $5.79 per thousand, so a 59-cent change per thousand. And then you could apply that to the varying property values. So that's what their impact was, 59 cents per thousand.
Okay. So Neil Steckschulte has put in the chat that Dane County has a good summary of previous elections with referendums included. So the link has been provided. We have a couple more questions in the chat, but I'd kind of like to open it up to questions from the participants for Phil and Brian. Any of the municipalities represented here today, have you gone to referendum? Are you contemplating a referendum? And what other questions would you have for our guest speakers today? You can just feel free to unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
I wanted to ask a question. My name is Amani. I'm an alder in the city of Madison, and I asked this in the chat, but just now, I'm wondering when when you have referendums that do not work, have you triaged or figured out why generally they don't work? When is it not a good time to do a referendum, or what things happened that did not make it successful?
I can start with that. I don't think we've really worked on enough referendums for our municipal clients to kind of dive deep into why, but there have been a couple in the Waukesha County area that have failed. One recently for the a joint fire district that serves a number of communities in a Waukesha County area, and it was, I believe, if I recall, 6 or 7 communities that were all asked to increase costs for fire service, additional fire service. And I believe 3 communities have passed it and the remaining 4 did not. I know there was a lot of chatter around why. Ironically, and this is probably not accurate, but the no's came from a lot of the townships, and they are kind of urban towns, but they came from the townships and the cities and village that were involved actually passed it. So I don't know if that has to do with information that was available. I think they did a pretty good job promoting it, but obviously we're not promoting it, but getting the word out as to why. It was all over the news in the area as well. But for whatever reason, that failed in all the urban towns. And maybe that's just maybe a reflection of how they view the government versus maybe a city or village. So I don't know if Brian has other examples that have failed.
I don't have ones that were where I was involved. Somehow, fortunately, just batting 1,000. But again, these aren't very, very common. Meaning, on the chart that we showed, it's about 10 municipalities on average for the past 4 years. So that have passed. Just anecdotally, for communities that have talked about, all right, we've had a failed referendum and given us a call to, look at other options. When I've talked to them about it, they've kind of said, we wish we would have done a better job, getting the information out. So I would say it's probably connected to messaging or the ability to get the message out. One community said they weren't prepared for kind of the social media backlash, and they didn't have anybody on staff that was monitoring social media. And they realized after the fact that there was, a Facebook page or whatever it was, literally dedicated vote no for this, and nobody had any idea that existed. So again, smaller community, that maybe didn't have the internal staff power to monitor something like that. So in my mind, kind of, that's a hard one to say, like, yes, we failed only because of that reason. But they kind of did realize, okay, maybe that was a shortcoming of our end where we could have done some messaging by creating a social media account for their community and talking about that information. Again, not saying vote yes and only yes, but just kind of spreading the message there, because of course the social media platform that said vote no went on all sorts of fun little tangents. So again, that was just spoken to me anecdotally and not from direct experience. So
Okay. Neil Steckschulte from the city of Monona, do you want to unmute yourself and pose your question, please?
Just in terms of looking at a capital referendum, an advisory capital referendum, is there an advantage to doing more of a formal referendum versus just doing a community survey? In terms of, if it was a scientific survey, are you getting more, is one more advantageous versus another?
Don't know if I have a great answer for that. My initial thought when I read it, Neil, was that the advisory referendum would probably be viewed by some as if an advisory referendum fails and you move forward with a referendum, I think there would come into question as to why did you do an advisory referendum? And so the community survey gives you information that maybe not held against you, if you will, if you decide to go to referendum. So, you know, advisory referendums are great, but again, I feel like you get boxed in pretty easily if it fails.
Mhm.
And so that would be my initial thought is why you may want to do a community survey instead.
Thank you.
Bill Burns from the city of Middleton. Bill, can you unmute yourself and just kind of share your experience with the group on the referendum that Middleton went through?
Sure. The city of Middleton had been considering a referendum for multiple years, going back before COVID, knowing that we had issues with staffing, both being able to fund additional staffing given net new construction as well as personnel costs. And that was put on hold due to the pandemic. And then when we started seeing inflation and personnel costs going up, we decided that we needed to go forward. There was a lot of debate over what level of referendum. At one point, we were looking at potentially a $1.5 million referendum. The council wanted to scale that back and was concerned about it potentially not passing if we asked for too much. So they identified the most important needs, scaled the dollar amount back to $770,000. That funded 4 positions, 2 police officers, a parks crew member, and a communications coordinator, as well as just providing additional funding for covering personnel costs increases and cost of living and health insurance. We started the communication process, I think, late in the game because we didn't decide on the final dollar amount in question until spring. And then we were scrambling to get information out, but we did work with a communications firm. Our council was behind it and held a number of community events, tried to get the word out the best we could. And ultimately, it was very successful, passing 62% to 38%.
Bill, when you look at the items that were approved, what the funding was approved for, obviously it was for ongoing expense, but did you have much pushback from your residents about asking for ongoing versus just either a limited time or one-time expense?
I didn't hear that as an issue. I hope we got the message out, and I think it was received that if you're going to be funding positions, that's going to have an ongoing impact. So that particular question was not one that I heard as a major concern.
Bill, I have a question also. How did you settle on the $770 dollar amount ongoing? Was it just one of those kind of, we gotta get the pulse of what the council will support and what the public will support? Was it more just trying to measure that versus asking for what you really need?
Yeah, we had done an internal staffing study that again started before the pandemic, and then we did a refresh of that kind of coming out of the pandemic in preparation for this. I think that identified about $3 million in requests across our different departments. The administration recommendation was for 1.5 million. We laid out different options for the council of what 500,000 would fund and 1 million and 1.5 million. And the 770 ended up being a compromise among the council that's where the majority felt comfortable.
Okay.
And Matt, I see your question. I'll look that up and post that in the chat.
All right, other questions, comments? I guess a question for Phil and Brian, when you've worked with the municipalities that you have, are they kind of doing this reluctantly, or they're just in such a financial position that it's kind of a last resort for them to take on a referendum?
I think it's more the latter, that they are kind of boxed in and have, this is the last option to them. But there are a few communities that I mentioned earlier that we do a lot of financial management plans that look out 5 years. As part of that plan, we look at operating costs as well, not just on the capital side, but operating. And through that planning process, you can kind of see where there's going to be a strangle point, right? Where there's going to all of a sudden, you're going to be in a position where you just aren't going to be able to add what you need in the way of positions based on projected net new construction. And so through that process, we've worked with a few communities that have proactively been far enough in advance of the need for it, where they start doing the PR work early on and getting the word out. And that's where we think it's most effective to get the word out early. Bill was obviously successful in Middleton in a kind of a short window, but it sounds like you brought on the right people to get the word out and recognize that you needed to do so. So I think, it's a little bit of both, Bob, but in most cases, it's the last resort.
Right.
I would add to that too, just from my experience, it also seemed like a more suitable option to put that in the hands of the community as well. So I'll just share an example with one community. They had the option of converting their public fire protection charge to which would eliminate a general fund expenditure, and therefore increase some levy capacity within their general fund budget. We're doing this, and the community felt it would be better to go to referendum instead of forcing that, just to get voter input on it. And those two options were presented, and the board decided to move forward that way. The interesting fact about that was it was also presented that obviously if you fail in that referendum and you do that public fire protection conversion anyway, now you're kind of sending the message, well, we're going to do what we want anyway, which ended up being true. And they ended up going that route because their referendum was not successful. One thing for that community that I thought made it unsuccessful is they had 2 staff members leave in the middle, and they literally stopped any communication. So I think it kind of surprised voters, even though they did hold 2 public information meetings that got about 20 people each. I don't think the remainder of their plan was carried through. We kind of stopped our engagement after providing the options, and then they kind of carried the torch from there. But then when we found out that it failed, when we kind of called around, they indicated that 2 staff members had left. So the only people really knowledgeable to carry the torch were gone there. So pretty unique circumstance. But again, just an example of they decided to use the referendum option to maybe put it in voters' hands, even though it didn't work. But I think that's why some communities will choose the referendum route.
Okay. Obviously, the municipal referendums are minimal in nature compared to school referendums, but do you have any percentage of how many municipal referendums were approved compared to school referendums?
It's something we could probably get for you. We don't have that.
Okay.
It's a drop in the bucket compared to school referendums get passed.
Right. Are there any municipalities that are contemplating a referendum that you at least want to talk about publicly today? Okay. Other questions for Phil or Brian? Okay. Phil or Brian, do you have any, or Chad, do you have a comment?
I was just going to add that Fitchburg's actually actively planning for a referendum in August right now.
Okay.
What is that for, Chad?
It'd be for ongoing operating expenses. We've actually have a survey hitting community mailboxes on or about March 6th that will identify their, I guess, preference for what might be in that referendum. We're looking at some public safety staff, potentially some city staff, increased funding for transit enhancements in the community, and then also the potential for operating costs associated with a new police services facility. The amounts in the survey that we have presented to the community range from 2.2 million all the way up to 5.8 million. And we utilized a Baker Tilly study that we had done last year, an organizational and staffing study to help kind of frame the justification for some of the staffing positions. And then also we offered all of our department heads a one-time opportunity to put in their request for the next 5 years from a personnel perspective during our operating budget process last year. And I think in total, between those two things, the Baker Tilly study and the department head requests, was somewhere in the vicinity of $7 million in additional personnel being requested over the next 5 years. So we've obviously pared that back through conversations with our city council and what they are most interested in potentially having in a referendum question.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 people with their hands up. I'll just go down the line and then we'll do a wrap up after this. So Alder Amani.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to get a better understanding on the other communities that were able to get referendums through. Were those municipalities or cities or villages or whatnot, were they first looking at budget cuts and then presenting that to the public that they had done that? Is that something that's expected, or is it something that, hey, like if you want to have your level of services, you know, this is what needs to happen? I'm wondering what process did they go through that led to success specific to budgets? And because the first thing that it seems like people will say is cut the budget.
Yeah, I think I can weigh in, and then it'd be interesting to hear what Chad and Bill have to say as well, because they probably had their own methodology they went through to make that determination of going to referendum. You know, in the cases that we have seen, a lot of times what's happening is, you know, they've gone through budget cuts over a period of time. So it is making the case of what if we are going to continue with the staffing that we have right now, we are going to have to we're going to have to cut people. And so that's part of the answer is getting the word out that you've gone through and systematically gone through budgets from year in and year out and had to make those cuts already. The other approach, and you know, we talked about the Butler case, and I'm sure it's the same with what's happening in Middleton and Fitchburg, is growth. Growth is occurring in many of those communities, and with that come additional service needs that aren't necessarily covered by net new construction. So it's making the case for the additional services that are needed to be provided to the community.
Okay. Regina, did you have a question?
Yeah, so Madison is in a particularly precarious situation because not only do we have a city budget deficit that we have to figure out how to manage, but so does our school district. And so the likelihood is that we are going to have the school district and the city going to referendum at the same time. And the school district, I know, is looking at both operating and facilities. So it's particularly fraught. And I'm just wondering if there's any advice aside from the beginning that said, don't do this. But we have kind of no, I mean, as everybody said, we're up against a wall as to where we are in both cases. So if there's any advice in how we approach this in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're getting gouged all at once.
Have you talked with the school district to talk about timing of each potential referendum?
I'm not sure if they're that far. They're already holding public meetings, and the city hasn't gotten that far. So it's possible they'll be not on the same ballot, but I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Phil, do you have any other advice?
No, not necessarily. I take hope in the response that was provided by the city of Middleton. It sounds like they had a school and a city referendum that passed the same time. So how did you manage that, Bill? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. So we had been talking with the school district. We knew they had a referendum planned. We were trying to time ours so that it would not hit at the same time. And then the school district moved up the timeline for their referendum. And we decided at that point that we just need to go forward, that we didn't want to wait any longer. We would do the best job we could to make the case. That might have factored into the council's decision to be conservative on the amount that we were asking for. And it was a significantly smaller amount that the city was asking for the school district. So maybe that helped, or at least did not hurt us when they looked at the two in comparison.
Okay. And then Mayor O'Connor from Monona, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just want to say Monona is planning for a referendum in November, actually, and a fairly decent chunk of ours is due to the need to, we just have to, we recently did a staff compensation study, and we have some areas that we really need to improve on so we can keep our staff, and they deserve to be adequately paid. And then we also would like to add a couple of some new positions as well, and we've talked anywhere from a range of 2.1 to 2.8 million. It's kind of on the higher end right now, but we're working with a communications firm as well, and we will be doing a survey similar to what Fitchburg's doing a little bit later this spring to help us kind of drill down and define that number a little better and see what kind of reaction we get from the community. So, but we had less than 0% net new construction
Oh,
when we were
boy.
planning the
Wow.
budget for this year, and we anticipate pretty much the same thing for next year. So we've cut. We haven't had any increases for anything other than actual staff needs in about 3 or 4 years, and it's just to the point where we don't have a choice. So.
Okay. So we've got a couple of minutes. We'll try to wrap this up at 1 o'clock. Phil or Brian, do you have any last comments? Closing comments?
No, the only thing I would add is, from the financial end of the analysis, if you're looking for assistance, that's something we can certainly help you with as well. We assisted Butler in a few of these cases to kind of drill down to a number that made some sense. So I would just offer that as an opportunity as well.
Okay. Well, thank you to Ehlers for facilitating this conversation today, and thank you to all the participants. I think this was a really good conversation, and I'm hoping that it was advantageous for all of you. So with that, we're ready to sign off, and everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Yep.